how to master HTML? You might be thinking that this guy is crazy. Everyone knows HTML, right? But stick with me, and in this video, I want to share a few important grown-up tips for HTML regards to that HTML and DOM area with you, and tell you how much you're missing out in your HTML basic learning. If you're new here, make sure you leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon. This is free of cost and helps the channel grow. So we cannot be discussing about what all of this is in depth or how you can learn it. You can check out the codedamm's full stack learning path. It's basically in the front end section at the top. But most of these things over here are important. At some point, you would need to understand them to have a better understanding of the front end tooling. All right, the first thing I think a lot of you guys miss out is on semantic tags plus SEO focused tags, right? So let's start with semantic tags first. So if you are one of those developers who use divs all the way, probably not a good idea in today's time because we have so many tags like section, main, aside, etc., which provide a lot more semantic meaning to things like screen readers, for example, for accessibility. So you should at least try to make use of the section or aside, section for a section, aside for a sidebar thing, main for some main content, and all the semantic tags which are there. These all are block tags, so you would have to like see which one is blocked, which one is not. But yeah, SEO focused tags. When I say SEO focused tag, what I mean is using the correct H1, H2, H3 headings and the meta tags for description and the title of the page, making sure you have the open graph tags enabled so that your HTML page works great on social media websites. So having all the SEO plus social media understanding, like what these websites or what these search engines expect you to write in your HTML code, is also an HTML understanding, right? A lot of people don't know about open graph tags, for example, which is used by Twitter, Facebook, pretty much all social media websites. When you share that link and that preview appears, right? This title, this description, and this image over here when you write something on social media. So that's open graph tags. When you are writing with H1, Google considers that as your heading of the page, one of the headings, right? Their most important headings should be H1 and H2, then H3, and so on in that order. So having this semantic understanding plus SEO focused understanding of tags in HTML is an important concept. The second focus should be on performance somehow. So when I say performance, what I mean is concepts like preloading and prefetching. So if you don't know about what preloading and prefetching are, these are some techniques to actually load some of the resources which you're sure that you would need eventually on the start of your web page when the web page just starts downloading, the HTML starts downloading. So these are like some performance hacks which a lot of frameworks use these days. Next.js, Remix. These frameworks like use it out of the box, right? So preloading the assets by default, prefetching them so that when you click on something, you don't have to wait for that page to be, downloaded from the end server. You already have that in the browser cache. So preloading, prefetching are a couple of techniques for speeding up your things, and these are done through link tags. There is no JavaScript or anything involved, although you can do some preloading with JS as well. But link tags are used for preloading and prefetching. Similarly, placements of script tag, for example, is also important. Which one you want to choose, async or defer, and where you should put it below body. That's like an important point so that you don't block the rendering of the main page and so on. So having these performance things which you can do with the HTML page itself is also one thing which I think you should spend some time in. Look for how preloading, prefetching works. Look for CSS content visibility. It's also like a new attribute. Now we are getting a little bit into HTML and CSS. So these are a few hacks and a few techniques which are very easy to learn and gives you massive performance boost benefits, but a lot of people don't know about. My third tip is around things like document object model and the shadow DOM, which is also becoming very popular, especially with our number 5 thing, which we will discuss. So hold on to that. But DOM and shadow DOM, these are like 2-3 concepts which are constructed out of your HTML document. So an HTML document is taken by the browser and it's constructed into a DOM, which is nothing more than an API, a kind of like there's an API surface over here, which is exposed to CSS, and another API is exposed to JavaScript. And this DOM is the actual thing which the user sees on the page, not the original HTML, the DOM which is constructed. And this is like a tree of all your nodes and tags and values and this and that. So know about how DOM works really with these JavaScript and CSS world. What are the APIs in JavaScript? It's document. In CSS, you have tag selectors and properties and keys and values. And know a little bit about what Shadow DOM is also. We're going to discuss Shadow DOM in number 5, like I said. But Shadow DOM is a part of DOM, which allows you to do some interesting things. So know a little bit more about DOM. It's not much about HTML, but compared to how HTML really works with JavaScript and CSS. My next thing for you is actually talking a bit about forms and data validation. You wouldn't know, so many people don't really know about how to use data validation in HTML5 forms itself. You probably don't need that 20 KB jQuery library or something to do validation with HTML forms, because now this is like very, very simple. You have to learn about the required attribute. You have to learn about how you can restrict the length of an input with max length, min length attribute. You can learn about how to restrict a particular format to a regular expression value, restrict the amount of the type of files which are being uploaded. And all of this is just done in HTML. I'm not talking about JavaScript over here. This is done in HTML itself. You can, I don't know the number of people I have seen which write a JavaScript code to have an input field, which when pressed on enter should do something, right? If you have written on key down and e.key code or e.something is enter, then do that. You just have to wrap this inside a form with on submit and you are done, right? Whenever somebody writes in this input field and hits enter, if there's a button, or heck, if there is not a button as well, this onSubmit function would be called, right? And if you want to take it one more step further, just like Remix does, Remix and its framework, you can also work with form action and form method and stuff like this. But for the most part, I do believe like a lot of validation and a lot of processing the form information is not a lot more accessible to people, especially with the frameworks like React and Vue and this and that, giving you all sorts of JavaScript powers within your HTML view that is obscured away, that this functionality and this stuff is already available in HTML. And the fifth and the final thing which I want to discuss, you should know as an HTML developer, is the concept of web components. Now, web components is not a relatively new technology. It's just that it hasn't taken off that much, but that doesn't mean that it's not relevant. It's very relevant, and it allows you to write reusable components with the help of HTML, CSS and JavaScript itself. And these are just like components you would hear in React or Vue or anything, but these are like standardized components for the web. They are reusable, and they use something known as Shadow DOM, which we briefly discussed in the third point when we're learning about DOM and Shadow DOM. So what Shadow DOM essentially is you can think of as a private part of a DOM tree, right? So what do I mean by that? If you have an HTML document which is constructed, you can have a Shadow DOM of this particular area where the CSS, for example, you're writing for the HTML you're writing it for is scoped, right? Just like you have CSS modules in React, if you have seen that, which is scoped to a particular module. Shadow DOM also allows you to have a region like that. But of course, it's more powerful and has a bunch of more features than that. But yeah, learning about web components, how to create your own web components, publish them online, use them in different applications is also something you should know about as an HTML developer, because sooner or later, if any one framework adds support for generic web components, you'll be seeing a lot more usage of that. So these were my 5 tips on how to master HTML. If you know some important tips which I have missed, and I have a couple of them in mind, I'll write them down in the comments myself. But if you know about a few things which you have learned in HTML and you think are important, leave a comment down below for others to learn with you. CSS is that one unavoidable thing which you have to learn as a developer if you want to build any decent front-end app. It doesn't matter if you don't like CSS or not, you have to code that, because the days are gone when you can just ship a raw HTML page. Now, in today's time, everyone expects you to have a nice, decent landing page, at least for your basic website as well. But what does it take to become a master, an expert at CSS? In this video, I want to discuss a few topics which are important, which you should consider visiting or revisiting if you haven't done them yet, and see if you really understand those topics or not, because there are infinite things in CSS. CSS pretty much is a programming language on its own at this point because it's too complex and there are so many new things you can try out. But these few fundamentals you are gonna need for pretty much anything you do in your CSS world. Let's take a look at that in this video. Alright, so the very first thing I'm going to start off with is the box model in CSS. Now, box model is so ridiculously important that I would not recommend pretty much anything else in CSS to learn before you actually learn box model. And a lot of people start not with box model, and that's completely fine, but given a choice to relearn CSS, I would learn a lot more about box model before I dive into anything else, especially of the layouts part, that is the grid and the flex box. Now, what exactly is box model? Well, very simply speaking, box model means how the margin, the padding, the borders, these properties behave around an element in CSS, right? So learning about if you have a content, how does the padding, and then the margin, and the border like really behaves is really the essence of the box model. So understanding that is like super important. Once you understand the basics of box model, I would recommend seeing if you actually understand layouts in CSS as well. At least for now, I would recommend Flexbox and grid layout. But if you want to really solidify your CSS learnings and understandings, you can also take a look at what is known as floats in CSS. Now, floats has a lot of use cases, except just not for layouts. It is used in a lot of hacky ways sometimes as well, and this is why this is a little bit dicey. So you should probably consider this when you are more like intermediate with CSS. Then figure out what floats are, how clear works, how floats on pseudo elements works, and so on. But for now, Flexbox and grid are your best friends in order to create most of the complex layouts you see on various websites, right? Now, when I say learn layouts, what do I really mean is that if I give you a layout, something like this, I want you to draw this layout in HTML and CSS with Flexbox and grid individually, right? And you should be able to do that. You should be able to visualize in your mind that, okay, if I want to do this with Flexbox, maybe this is one element, then this might be another element, and so on. So you should be able to visualize how you would make that particular layout. Similarly for grid as well. And the more layouts you practice with, the better your understanding would get in terms of how Flexbox and grid and these various properties on these layouts work. So like this is like super important. The third thing I would recommend for you is to actually understand about units in CSS. This is also very important, and a lot of times people overlook this. When you get confused between pixels, EMs, rems, sometimes even pointers, VH, VW, so these all sorts of older and newer units are there now. So understand about them. What does truly a pixel mean? How does it differ on various screens? Like, if you're using a website on a Retina iPad, what does the pixel really mean? And this is like kind of an advanced stuff, or a little bit on the advanced side, but we are talking about how you master CSS. And a person who knows a lot about CSS would actually know a lot about these units as well. How rem works, how rem in conjunction with EM or pixel works. So there are all sorts of nuances around how these units work and operate in CSS. So learn about them. After this, I would also recommend learning about a bunch of new CSS3 things. For example, calc function is super handy, super useful. Variables in CSS is very useful for reusability and keeping your code base clean without actually using things like Sass. So that is also very important. New features like, new units, for example, VH and VW are also something which you can cover in this one. So having a look at and knowing about what CSS3 features or CSS3 plus as well, which is like, beyond CSS3, what all sorts of features are available and what can you use right now in browsers. Super important stuff. Now, while we are discussing about units in general, I also want to tell you that how important it would be for you to learn about how to make your websites responsive using CSS media queries. So understanding about media queries in general and about making your websites responsive in general is also like, I would say, the fundamental difference between a good developer and a master developer in CSS, right? Those people know how to set breakpoints. Those people know when to change the layout from this complex layout to a simple stack-based layout, which is usually what you would find on mobile phones, and how to do that. That's also like super important. When I say how, I mean like usually purely with CSS, because if you use JavaScript, it involves all sorts of cumulative layout shifts and hacks and this and that. But yeah, I mean, making sure that you know about how media queries operate, how you can make them responsive, and your website responsive with the correct units in place. This is like already getting too much into a little bit of advanced side of things. So I would highly recommend you to take up your few projects which you know which were not responsive, or just download a few projects which are not responsive and try to convert them to responsive there. Sixth, I would recommend about animations. So animations obviously is not for everyone, in the sense that obviously not every front end would require a lot of animations. But if you're talking about mastering CSS, then animations is a big part of that, because animation has first class support in CSS. You can create some beautiful animations, especially with CSS3 and the new keyframes and this and that things which are not available before. You can do a lot more damage. So learning about all sorts of keyframes and how they work. I would also throw in something like Bezier curves. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but Bezier curves is it's like a mathematical formula of having how an animation proceeds from 0 to end. So some animations you would have seen, they start fast and they end slow, right? So this is like one example of a Bezier curve. Some animations start very slow and then immediately ends, right? Some animations which are linear, they have a Bezier curve of this. So understanding about these curves, which curve might look better in what sort of animation, spring animations, this and that. So this is also a little bit on the UX side of things. But again, if you're working with CSS, you pretty much are working with the user experience. So you have to know a little bit about that as well. Seventh thing which comes to my mind is using something like PostCSS, or not exactly using, at least knowing about PostCSS and Sass. Now what these tools do is that, just talking a little bit about Sass, is that it gives your CSS superpowers, in the sense that you can nest your selectors, you can use variables, you can use functions, you can do all sorts of stuff. But to be honest, the only two features which I have really used when I'm using Sass is variables in CSS, which is also like natively available now. And the second one is actually the nesting of selectors. This is probably the best feature out there. And I wouldn't be too surprised if CSS brings native support for nesting selectors in the next 4 or 5 years. So that is awesome. Other than that, PostCSS is also very useful, especially when you don't want to write a lot of CSS properties, but want to, let's say, support all sorts of browser quirks. So Auto Prefixer is a plugin for PostCSS, which allows you to, just write something once and then generate the WebKit or Moz or this and that styles automatically. Then there are some plugins like CSS Nano, for example, and all sorts of bunch of plugins which you can hook into this PostCSS ecosystem, which allows you to manipulate your final CSS generation. So what this tooling does is that it allows you to write fresh, clean, modern CSS, but also then backport it to all the previous browsers which might need some hacks or something to support that code out of the box. So knowing about this tooling is super important. And then last but not the least, but the 8th point I can think of, is knowing your way around DevTools of CSS. Now, DevTools is a game changer, of course, and you have to learn them as a front-end developer. But knowing how to navigate your way around DevTools is also super important skill, especially because CSS, just like HTML, does not complain if that is not working, right? For example, if you use PostCSS and a couple of plugins, you can actually add a layer of validation in CSS. But if it isn't working, if the CSS isn't working, then you have to directly inspect the DOM, right? You have to see what is happening on the website, really, in the DOM tree. So knowing about DOM and nodes and CSS specificity and how CSS works, and how you can manipulate the CSS using DevTools, how you can debug that essentially from your browser directly, it's a game changer and it's a must requirement for anyone who wants to master CSS. So yep, these were my 7-8 points on how you should master CSS, what all things you need to learn, bare minimum basics to master CSS. And if you have a clear, thorough understanding of all these topics, you're gonna have a really good time working with CSS, trust me. A lot of people don't even completely know about box model in general or the layouts part in general. So you can trust me when I say that if you have clarity on all these 7-8 topics, you are probably way ahead than 95% of the people right now in web development. So this video assumes that you already have a basic understanding of JavaScript. You are able to create pages. You even have experience with React or any other framework. You have worked with Node.js a little, or at least heard about it. You have a basic experience in building an app with JavaScript. Now, the next question becomes, what all things or what all you need to do to become an advanced developer? Maybe you are working for 1, 2, 3, 4 years in a job where you have gained some experience, but what's next in JavaScript? How do you level up to a senior developer or become a great developer with JavaScript? In this video, I'll be discussing some points which are going to be very important in order to do that. Now, the first point which I want to mention is we'll start with the language and then go deep down into the actual JavaScript under the hood stuff. I'm going to start with the first thing, that is more concepts. What you are really doing oftentimes, and you might have also realized this, is you use a very small subset of knowledge to do a very large number of tasks, right? If you're building a React app, it might seem like React have a lot of things to learn, but when you're actually building some component, when you're actually creating a state or some sort of interactivity, your 95% of the work is probably done with just 20% of the knowledge required in React. Right? In that case, a lot of times if you have taken up a JavaScript course or anything, you probably either miss out on some important concepts or don't even learn them, right? So some of those concepts are, for example, closures in JavaScript. You might be using this all the time, but this is an important part of the language, right? Another one which comes to my mind is prototypes in JavaScript. Again, this is not used that much, therefore it might be difficult to just understand this, but these are underlying features and underlying ways of the language working, and you should know them, because if you are becoming an advanced developer, chances are you would be thrown at any random piece of code and you have to at least make some idea out of it, or you have to be comfortable on the first look. You cannot just Google that what this program is even doing, right? I mean, you should Google stuff, but you should not be a developer who has absolutely no idea what a program does when you're looking at it until it's like, some really cryptic code. And even in this more concepts, we can also place in something like new features, which are new things JavaScript as a language is adding. Now, I'm not a lot in favor of this because now releases a new version of ECMAScript every single year. So sometimes I feel like they are just pushing in new features all the time. But yeah, I mean, for some of the features are really interesting. So maybe for point 3, just following a regular YouTube channel like codedamn or any other channel out there would be just more than enough. All right, let's go down a little bit. This is, on the surface. You probably might have done this already. You might not have. The second thing you should know as a beginner or intermediate to advanced developer is how the asynchronous model in JavaScript works. And when I say asynchronous model, I mean the following concepts. Obviously, the first one you might have guessed when we say about asynchronous in JavaScript behavior, and that is event loop. Now, how does JavaScript really work? Like, what's the true behavior of JavaScript? It is not a simple language which is understood on the runtime and then executed line by line. It's not as simple as that. It uses something which is a little bit complex, known as event loop. I have done multiple videos on JavaScript which goes into one way or another in event loop. I'll link some video here which is an advanced Node.js course, some part of which covers event loop in great detail, but maybe we'll do a standalone video for event loop as well. So event loop is important. Again, this brings us to topics like micro task queues, and this is basically part of event loop and stuff, promises and callbacks, how these things like really work. Because I mean, it's all fine and good as long as you have an await of XYZ and then, some sequential code. But let's say you are debugging a piece of software which has a bug. If you have these knowledge inside your head, then you might be able to think of that scenario that what might happen, right? Now, for me, what happens is a lot of times when I'm working with a code base, just getting that error again just triggers some memory that, oh, I have seen this bug before because of how promises and how microtask and different sort of queues behave, right? It might be rare, but again, if you want to be on the advanced side, you would have to have experience with the rare situations as well. Because for pretty much all beginner and intermediate doubts and questions, you will find them on Stack Overflow on GitHub. This can also include stuff like, going deep into V8, like how OS level stuff works. Again, this is discussed in that advanced Node.js course. For example, your JavaScript is not truly single-threaded. Why? Because your operating system is multi-threaded, right? So even if your Node.js process is sitting right here, it can use your operating system, which is Windows or Mac or anything, and this can spin up multiple threads for, let's say, network requests, right? You're sending 4 network requests in JavaScript. So this is not a single-threaded behavior, right? Your Node.js is single-threaded, but your operating system sends the network request. So it might be indirectly multi-threaded, but yeah, I mean, just understanding about things like these can unlock a lot of brain juice for you to use to debug different issues. Talking so much about debugging actually brings me to the third and probably the most important aspect of a senior developer or somebody who has worked a lot with JavaScript, and that is debugging and profiling your code. And this is a territory where I am also learning a lot of new things every single day. I'll tell you what. So what debugging really means is that you are able to efficiently debug a program, right? And this will obviously have some qualitative and quantitative qualities. The first one is experience. The more experience you have, the more errors you have seen, the more weird edge cases you have seen, the more quickly you will be able to trigger that memory cell in your brain the next time you see that, right? But alongside experience, what you can do is you should also start using the debugger, which is the Node.js debugger, or you're using Chrome debugger, or VS Code also ships with a Chrome debugger because VS Code is essentially running on Electron, which is Chrome. But start using debuggers, official debuggers of the language. I mean, it sounds cool to use console log and it's all meme and fun and all jokes, but real debugging can only happen in serious code bases when you're using these debuggers most of the time. I mean, console logs are definitely helpful, but if you want to just check and sit back and even reverse engineer, I mean, I do a bunch of reverse engineering videos that cannot be done absolutely without debuggers. So that stuff requires you to have a bit of debugging knowledge with JavaScript. And profiling is interesting because this is, like I said, something I'm also learning. I don't have a lot of experience with how you really profile your code in a great way. But profiling essentially means, let's say your code has a memory leak. How do you debug that? So this involves something like V8 snapshots for, you just take the heap snapshot, which is the area where all the variables and stuff is allocated, and then you try to figure out which part of the memory is growing continuously. And if you are working on a more senior level, Netflix level stuff where they are using Node.js in production, you can also use flame graphs to actually profile how bad Node.js CPU execution is. So what does this mean? This means flame graphs is one of the tools which is used to see how slow or fast, or how much CPU time is being consumed. So let's say you have a job at Netflix where you have to speed up a certain execution because it's critical and it runs a billion times a day or something, and that uses Node.js. So your first job would be to actually figure out what is the biggest bottleneck in that program execution, right? And bottlenecks are usually CPU bound with Node.js because of Node.js being a relatively slower language or a runtime. A lot of people get triggered when I say Node.js is a language, but the idea here is that profiling your code with the heap snapshots and debugging your CPU usage with things like flame graphs, this is sort of advanced, right? This is, I won't say like you would need this even as an advanced developer in a lot of cases, but when you're doing a lot of profiling, this becomes really, really interesting, right? So if you have any more profiling information, please feel free to share in the comments below. I am also learning this area, but 2 things which I have found are memory leaks and CPU execution, and these are the tools which you have to learn in order to be a good developer. Now this is all fine. I mean, we just kept going down in the in the complexity, but I believe you should also be aware about the general ecosystem and the toolkits. Like I said, whether those are debuggers, whether those are, just logic and how you debug some practices, whether those are tools like Webpack or Babel. Because if you're not familiar with ecosystem, and especially these tools like on front end, they play a major role. They might just catch you off guard, right? So just know about the existence of these tools, what their purpose is. Babel is for transpiling, Webpack is for bundling. That's pretty much it. And if you know everything else, you can basically figure out the ecosystem, relatively quickly. But mastering this part with the help of a lot of experience is the hard job. And again, this is information, sure, this is something you need to learn, but this is also a combination of a lot of time, which is like, another word of saying experience. So there are two barriers to becoming an advanced developer. The first one is obviously the information, where you consume it, and the time, which is pretty much you cannot overcome that. Everyone has a different range of time over which they will learn something, right? But this is in general, I believe, a good way of going the advanced level. And a lot of topics on this board you can find on the codedamm's full stack developer path, which again, I pretty much leave the comment as a pinned comment in every single video. So make sure you check out the full stack developer path. If you're somebody who's just starting off, if you're somebody who's just intermediate, we will have these courses, if not now, definitely this year, up and running on more advanced side of things as well. And of course, meanwhile, you can just go ahead and check the Node.js advanced course as well, which is hosted on YouTube, which is also on codedamn if you have full stack developer path access. But yeah, that's pretty much it for what I wanted to share in this video. One thing which I have seen a lot of people asking in the comment section on YouTube as well as on codedamn is how they can properly master React.JS. And to be honest, there is no one right answer to these questions. How do you master something? There is no one set framework for that. But of course, there are a lot of bad ways to do that. So we can definitely avoid that and follow one of the good ways. So in this video, my aim is to actually cover a few topics which I do believe are required if you want to master React.js. This is for people who have already started working with React and you want to take it to the next level. So how do you do that? What things you have to be careful for? Let's discuss in this video. Okay, so before we discuss how to master React, let's understand a bit about what React in itself is. So React is a UI library, which is not a framework. This means that React in itself would almost always not be a complete package in itself to build your full web application, right? You will need a lot of things with React working with it, whether that's for basic stuff like HTTP request or caching or some central store, to as big as like design systems and what have you, anything which comes to your mind. So it's a library, it's not a full-blown solution like Angular. So this is why mastering React not just involves the library itself, but a lot of other things in the ecosystem as well. So we're going to start off by simply dividing this into three parts. The first one is the core React itself. So this part includes stuff where I believe you should be knowing and having a lot of clarity on these topics. If you don't have, you can take a step back and try to learn about them more. So especially with Reacts, right now, having a massive clarity on how hooks really work, not just how to use them, but what is exactly happening with hooks is especially useful, and especially with use state, use effect and use ref. The way these three hooks work, if you know how exactly they work, what the use effect dependencies do, how the use state re-renders the functional component, and how use ref values can be mutated and can be used as a single source of truth among all these different functional component state updates, which is done by use state. So if you know about these three hooks, you are probably much better than most of the React developers out there, because a lot of developers don't really know how the hooks really work and how you can make them work in a specific way, right? The best example how hooks work is try to set up some sort of timers using use effect. So try to create some applications where you delay the time yourself. So this could be something which requires, for example, let's say if I give you random bars on an application, then you have to build an application which sorts these bars one step at a time. So one step takes 1 second. I'm just giving you this as an assignment to check if you know React well or not. So you have to like switch the position of the bar, just follow any sorting algorithm, merge sort, quick sort, whatever, and then swap them. Do this complete exercise with use effect, use state, and timers, right? Set timeout, set interval, stuff like this. If you're able to do this nicely with all the start and stop controls and without actually your application being buggy, you know that you understand how use effect and use state will work. Because building an application with timers like this, which has the correct stop, start, and even unmount and mount behavior, would actually require you to have correct understanding of these hooks and how React functional components work. The second part over mastering React is the React ecosystem itself. Now, this is the part where a lot of people miss out on what you need to know apart from React itself. Because like I said, React is a UI library. It's not enough in most of the cases to build everything in a medium to large size application. So in this ecosystem part, there are a lot of tools out there, but you have to pick or choose certain tools wisely if you want to save time. For example, if you are making network requests and you have backend, which is GraphQL, let's say, then in that case, Apollo GraphQL might be a better choice as a networking library. Otherwise, you have libraries like UseSWR, you have libraries like React Query, which is like, I would recommend React Query because this is like a good library. Plus, we also have a codedamn course on React Query, so you can check that out. Similarly, for UIs, you can have Chakra UI. In React, you can have Tailwind, which is not specifically with React, but it's more like, popular in React world. You can also have Material UI, which is again something available right out of the box in React. So you can look at, there are a lot of UI systems, so you can pick one and try to work with that. Then in terms of like server-side rendering this, you have frameworks like Next.js, for example. There is also one framework I'm hearing a lot about called Astro Build. So Astro Build is there. So, just knowing about these things as well for server-side rendering and performance. This is basically React, right? Everything over here is React. You just have to know a bit about the ecosystem in which you're playing. And then finally, I would recommend focusing a bit more on advanced React concepts as well. So advanced React would basically involve stuff like suspense, for example, React 18 plus basically. So suspense and server-side rendering and React server component. So stuff like this would go over here, right? So you definitely don't really want to jump to advanced React part, React 18 plus things. And React 18 plus sounds like, something which is actually you should do later, but it's the version for React. So yeah, focusing on this advanced side of things should definitely come after the core React concepts and React ecosystem. But this is something I believe you should also know, because this is where the world would be headed in the next 1 to 2 years if React maintains its position as the top framework, one of the top frameworks. Libraries, don't kill me yet. But yeah, moving on to these React server components and suspense, this would be mostly used with Next.js itself or, similar frameworks out there. So know a little bit about more features which have been introduced in React 18, which will be introduced in React 18. Remember, it's still in alpha, and try to learn about them. Whether that's server-side rendering, streaming support, React streaming support from server and stuff like that. So yeah, there is a lot to learn within the React UI library itself. So you should not definitely be just overwhelming yourself. Take your time to get into the core React part, then the React ecosystem, and then moving on to the advanced parts. But I hope this video would be helpful in order to determine what things you should do. If you use these things, for example, and you have no idea how they work, it might be a good idea to just take a step back and learn about them in great detail. You can find all the links in the description for these specific courses on codedamm's full stack learning path if you're thinking to master React this year before 2021 ends. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. If you liked it, make sure you leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Send it to a friend who can find this video useful as well. That is all for this one. I'm gonna see you in the next video really soon. If you're still watching this video, make sure you comment down in the comment section, I watched this video till the end. Also, if you're not part of codedamm's Discord community, you're missing out a lot on events which we organize on a weekly basis to code. You already know the drill. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and thank you so much for watching.